each of these are films are very specific to a place, and I think they draw their power from each of your attention, the attention that you that you give to this place, an incredible time investment that you give to this to these places and the people and the creatures that inhabit them. I want to ask you each about your relationship to the places in your stories. So, Tamara, let me start with you. You're from Macedonia. What is your relationship to this remote place where we see this woman keeping honey?
Hi, everyone. I would say that one of the most important thing in films in general is that you choose a place that's a character by itself. So this place, we can say we both didn't know, me and the other co-director, before we started doing the research. This is a well-known area because of the river Bragalnica and because of many nature conservation projects that take place there. And it's also very special because the river Bragalnica is the only river in Macedonia, I don't know, like more far away, that changes its natural way of flowing every 10 years or so. And as the river changes, the whole environment changes. Villages remain abandoned and they get reborn again when the river comes back. So this is the destiny of the village where Atija lives. It constantly, through the ages, it was abandoned and then people came again. So you can see various artifacts of just completely different eras, like Romans, then like Second World War, then Turkish population. So there's just very, very diverse like cultural artifacts there. And this is why the research we made took about 3 months just for the area before we discovered Atija. So it took us a while to get to know the place, to really connect with this place. And
you started out being drawn by the place.
Yes. Yes. The place around this river in particular. And
can I ask you, in your own experience, do you come from a background that has kind of similar, being close to the land, like Khadija?
Well, I think all of us in Macedonia have ancestors that are very close to the land, and also in my case, yes, all my ancestors, all my grandparents, they're even until today, they're very closely connected to the land. And this is a subject that actually is my main interest even for the future films, how generations are connected and disconnected from the land and from their natural habitats.
Needless to say, here in New York City, we live a different experience. we probably fit more into the disconnected mode. John, that leads me to you. You had a background as a filmmaker with, I think, a bent for doing natural history type projects. And as we see in the film, you and your wife Molly were, living a city life in Los Angeles, California, when you decided, time to get back to the land, if you want to say it that way, and you started this farm, which you chronicle over 8 years. Can you talk about your background? How you grew up, what your connection to nature is, and what drew you into that kind of filmmaking in the first place?
Yeah, I I grew up on the eastern shore of Maryland, which is a very rural area, mainly growing corn and soy to feed Purdue chickens. That's all of my neighbors, and then I had experiences that I thought made me somewhat familiar with farming, in that I worked on 2 farms, but I was driving a tractor and weed whacking. I knew nothing about soil, so there was this. I was like, when Molly and I talked about this, I was like, oh yeah, I mean, I grew up on a farm, I know how to do this, but I didn't know anything. And so, there was always a connection to nature in that there was an island called Assateague Island, which is all of these sort of wild ponies, and it's sort of a self-contained ecosystem. I spent a lot of time there as a kid. So it's always been something that I've been drawn to, but the filmmaking led me to like Los Angeles. Anyway, we picked Ventura County not knowing that we had landed in the middle of a community that was focused on, the principles of an extractive farming method. So
Big Ventura County is a place to create your farm.
yes, right. And it's essentially like a chaparral sort of environment, and incredibly dry, ridden with fires, as you now know. We're right in the middle of all of that. But we just had this idea that we could sort of regenerate the land and right the wrongs of the past, but had no idea just in how incredibly damaged this piece of land was. And the thing was, from at least the filmmaking perspective, I was forced, and I quit the film business at that point and was launching into this career as like a farmer. But I spent every day there for 8 years. And I was watching this story unfold that I had never anticipated, and that was of these mutualistic relationships that exist from like a bacterial level to a hawk, and how all these things were kind of working together to find some sort of semblance of balance to these epidemics of pests and disease. And I kept shooting things. At first it was like on an iPhone or a 5D, and then I got an Amira, and around year 5 I realized I'd been collecting all of these keystone players. They were actually now rebalancing these, like I said before, these epidemics. And I'm like, when is any filmmaker going to quit his career and spend 8 years inside the belly of a story like this? And I thought I might be the only witness that has had the ability to capture it in the way that I did. And I felt this burden of responsibility to launch myself back into the storytelling process, but I was like more inspired than I'd ever felt in the 25 years of making films. Anyway, so it was really my relationship to the land, to get back to your original question, was I couldn't leave it, so I was forced to see it every single day. And those rhythms, when I picked up on those rhythms, I was able to sort of be there at the right spot and capture those moments that normally would be really difficult.
Mark, you and your filmmaking partner, Victoria Stone, made Elephant Queen. You have a long history filming in Africa. Can you kind of summarize that history for us?
Well, we started in Africa back in 1987. And at the time, Vicky and I were filming underwater. And we were just starting our careers. And we were loving, just being sent around the world for the BBC. And at that stage, we got a call from Alan Root, who we thought at the time was the best filmmaker, wildlife filmmaker in the world, and he lived in Africa. And he said, "Will you come out and film with me? I want to do a series about Serengeti." And we tried to refuse for a year because the last thing we wanted to do was to be in a vehicle on the plains in Africa because we were loving our underwater life. And in the end, because of Alan's stature within the industry, because he produced authored films. He both filmed and wrote and produced his films, which was at that time was unusual. And we said, well, we have to do it. So we went for 3 years in 1987, and it's been 30 years, and we're still there. I think Africa just gets into it. It's very hard to sort of shake the dust off your sandals and come back once you've made that commitment. And then with the Elephant Queen, we'd started our career there in Tanzania. We then came to Kenya, where Alan was based. And Tsavo National Park was one of these iconic areas which we'd heard of for years, but it had the reputation of being very difficult. It's a huge place, the size of Massachusetts. It's dense bush in most places. There's not that density of wildlife compared to places like the Serengeti, where we'd started. But what it has is these iconic elephants, these enormous tuskers. And there are only probably 12 or 13 of them in Tsavo, and probably less than 20 on the planet. And it was really that drive to tell an elephant story, but to do it in Tsavo, which we knew would be difficult right from the outset. But we were just so drawn to those, just to to document the last of those huge tuskers, but tell a story about them at the same time.
I want to ask you about shaping your stories, because you're shaping these stories sometimes around nature and sometimes around things that you couldn't predict. Tamara, let me start with you. You know, the arc of your story is we meet this woman, Hadija, when she's living relatively isolated with her mother on this land. And as we see in the trailer, this family moves in next to her in their camper, and big boisterous family, and it sort of changes the mood of the place. When you started filming with Hadija, what did you think you were filming? Could you anticipate? Did you know that the space was going to be changed by an incoming family?
No, we didn't.
Because that's your whole friggin' film.
That's the beauty of making documentaries. It took us a while to make the decision, who will we start shooting with? Will it be Atije or will it be her brothers, who are also bee hunters? Eventually we decided to stay with her because she had the most unique story, living alone in this village with her mother. Meanwhile, her brothers, they already moved. They have their families, their life outside of, like, also in another village, but in civilization. And Atije, being the last born female in this Kazalbashi family tribe, she stayed. It was her destiny to stay with the parents. This is their tradition, basically. And we started with her. In the beginning, we were just impressed by their relationship, her and her mother. This was so amazing for us to witness. And we just started from
You
there.
haven't seen the film. Her mother is an alien woman in her 80s, pretty much in bed all day, and Hadija brings her food and has a very loving, touching relationship with her.
For those who have seen the film, basically what we were amazed about was that we saw the resemblance with bees. Atije being the worker bee and her mother being the queen bee, who never abandons the nest. And Atije must do everything for her, never must leave. So at the beginning, this was our storyline, the one we were following. We thought that this will be a shorter film, maybe 30 minutes, and we will just follow this resemblance with the bee family and her life. After 6 months of shooting, this family appeared, and all of our lives were changed at that moment. They are nomads, so they come and go every season. We found this out from Atije. And also we found out that they have a long history of arguments in the past years. So at this moment, we had to make a crucial decision. We just had a couple of team meetings. Are we playing all in or not? Because these people were obviously very difficult to approach and not even think to work with. We had to kind of make this risk, make a couple of shootings just to see if this will work out. And how we had the luck to witness how Atije talks with the children, how she communicates with them, how close she is with them, because she doesn't have children of her own. And we started shooting just her and the kids. So some of the first scenes with them is how they're interacting with Atije, how they're playing, they're eating, they're saying songs and stories. And in this way, they were also like, we gained their trust. And after that, we continued with the parents. So once we gained the children's trust, it was easier to approach the parents.
John, you described being 5 years into your project of starting this biodiverse farm, where you felt the compulsion to tell a story about it. You know, kind of walk us through, once you couldn't let go of that idea, you know, how did you start thinking about shaping this into a story?
Well, if you step back and we ask ourselves, like, how is it that we are not farming in a regenerative and connected way with nature? It sort of spins around this idea that when it's not cooperating with it elicits all this fear. And so then the culture has created chemicals and methods of agriculture to control the fear and the unknown of what nature's intent is behind why it's doing what it's doing. And so the premise really for our farm, and really the exploration that the film sort of takes you on, is this idea that the antidote to fear is curiosity. And as we would remind ourselves that a lot as we would see things being destroyed, because to understand deeply why the bad thing exists is your greatest opportunity to find where you can intersect with a natural system that is in place for a reason. And so that really is the theme that I use to sort of carry the whole film through, and it parallels our philosophy of how we were sort of inventing the things to sort of come alongside of nature. But it wasn't until 8 years into the whole thing that I realized that the one interesting element of it was that I was actually not as optimistic as my wife. So in the editing process, I had to actually, it was kind of a humbling moment for me when I realized I'm portraying myself as someone who was actually believing in this as much as she was. And so as I went back through on another edit of the film, I put the truth in there, and that was that I was the skeptic throughout the whole thing. So I don't know if I answered your question there.
Mark, in the case of the Elephant Queen, the broad journey of this film is following this matriarch elephant you call Athena in the film, as she leads her herd on a search for water over many months. How, when you began the filmmaking process, what did you think you were going to be capturing, and did that change?
I think when we started, we thought it would be more based perhaps around the waterhole, because we'd done recce's in that area of East Africa from the air. We've got a small plane, and every time we found a nice waterhole, we'd say, okay, that can be our focus. And if we know a waterhole, we'll find an elephant family that uses it. And we had the arc of that story. We wanted to show the animals that were dependent on the elephants, that lived at the waterhole. And then we weren't really sure. We knew the waterholes were seasonal, but we didn't know necessarily where the elephants would go. So it was about trying to find that spot and really sort of embed ourselves there. And that was what actually took the time. And the first waterhole we found was outside the national park, which for us was good because it meant filming fees were less. And from the air, we found this amazing waterhole, and looking down on it, we could see that there were shoals of bullfrog tadpoles in there. There were birds feeding on them. We even found a crocodile there, and it was like this was the perfect oasis. And we moved in there, and we rehabilitated an old camp that was nearby, cut an airstrip for the planes, and then we thought,
as one does when you're making a film.
Well, that's the way we have to, because we spend 2 years. That actually was 4 years in the field filming, and we tend, we really like to be there, living it, and we often find that it takes about 6 months before we always start filming something, but then it takes about 6 months before we really get to know the place, and we've experienced a season or two. But what happened with the first place we tried was that it looked amazing, and we knew it would dry, but it never rained again there. And at that stage, we looked at the waterholes around us, and they were getting poachers were targeting them for the elephants, and the elephants there didn't have the degree of protection they have inside a national park. And it came to a head one day when a ranger vehicle was ambushed about 600 meters away from our camp, and 2 unarmed rangers were shot, and they were brought into our camp bleeding heavily, and our assistant director, Etienne Olive, flew them to the nearest hospital in his plane, 15 minutes away, and one of them died en route. And at that stage, we thought, well, this actually is completely untenable. We've got a duty of care to our team, our small team, but also the elephants were so scared that they weren't coming into the waterholes by day, and at night, when they did come in, that was when the poachers came in as well. So that all those things persuaded us that, if we were going to carry on making the film, we'd have to go into the national park. And that's what we did. And the interesting thing was when we got inside the national park, we were seeing some of the same elephants, but their behavior, elephants are amazing animals in that they know when they're safe. And in the national park, their behavior totally changed. They were out in the day, they allowed us to get closer in the vehicles, and it was only really then that we thought, okay, we've actually got a chance now of finishing this film, of finding a really charismatic matriarch and getting the film made.
I want to ask each of you about the experience of filming with animals. In the history of documentary film, there's a body of criticism about the way animals can be portrayed in films. There's a tendency to turn animals into more human-like characters, maybe than is appropriate. You can make an animal seem lovable. You can make an animal seem intimidating. And I'd like to hear from each of you, how you, thought about that. But Tamara, we think of bees in your film, but there's other animals too. That nomad family that moves in, has a herd of cows, and there's a scene kind of early in the film when they've just moved in that is very menacing, where the cows are kicking children, and the sound design of the film is made me not want to be in that space. So I wonder whether it was bees or cows or anything else, if how much you were conscious about how you interpreted animal behavior.
Well, I must say it was easier to work with bees than with Hussein's family, for sure. They're more polite. We never got stung because we were under Hatice's protection. She
Literally, you
explained-
never got stung.
Never. Only one of the cinematographers got stung because unfortunately he's Turkish and he had to work with Hussein's family, so we can talk with them, and he got stung from their bees. But bees, I think they...
So you're really expressing this relationship that the beekeeper has with their bees, and whether that's a peaceful relationship or an antagonistic relationship.
Well, they are a mirror to the one that keeps them. So for us also it was surprising. But all of us, we don't have a problem with bees or insects or any kind of animal. Probably if there was some of us who has some kind of problem or is allergic, probably this would not work. So definitely with the bees was easier to work than with the cows, for example, and with that other site. There was one situation, because that scene in the film is made from maybe 10 shooting scenes, because they do this every day. So the first time we actually entered there, we were just like this. Everywhere around us, there were cows running and kicking, and we were just like, okay, what do we do here? And then we slowly started to
Figure out how to film that without getting kicked.
yes, you can say. And eventually, from these 10 scenes, there is one beautiful and disturbing scene at the same time. But I think in our case, what was most helpful, I'm pretty sure that in their cases it was more difficult to work with animals because you were directly in contact with the animals. In our case, it was more the relationship that the people had with the animals that we were observing. We were not directly, we didn't have to make direct connection with these animals, so it was easier in this way.
John, can you talk about filming the animals on your farm? You've got pigs and chickens and roosters and a whole menagerie. And how did you think about approaching that?
Well, the whole thing and the reason the film really sort of more follows the story of the animals is because if we're trying to build a farm based on biomimicry, right, the mimicking of nature's patterns, you have to understand these relationships. And one thing that if you've not farmed before, and you're farming in a humane way, you're going to develop relationships with your animals. And by the way, even if you don't name them, because number 9 is one of my favorite sheep. And I didn't realize we used to say don't name them anymore, but then you develop number 4 is one of my favorites, number 9. So it's the same thing. But I will say one thing. There's one moment that I did anthropomorphize in the film, and that was a sexual relationship between a rooster and a pig, which I get asked about a lot, because then there's these piglets that are born, if you haven't seen the movie, and they're the same color as the rooster. And most of the people that ask me about that are in their 40s or 50s. The little kids get it, but I have to explain it sometimes to older people that that's not physically possible. The rest of it was really about looking for these complex answers about our own life and the human condition of our desire to assign meaning and purpose at the same time that you're reconnecting with an animal that you're farming. And so I was trying to tell these stories through their relationships, and the way we were able to capture it, because there's some really cool moments that are just like, how did you do that? It was more around just watching these rhythms repeat every single day. I mean, I watched the dance between a rooster and a pig as they went to bed every night, and had their whole routine for like 30 days in a row before I finally said, I should probably shoot this, because no one would believe that this actually happens, that they court each other into this bed every night. So it was really about, what I had at my advantage as a filmmaker was the amount of time that I was able to spend on the farm observing these things to put myself in the right spot. The last thing I'll say is there was a Cooper's hawk, and every time she had eggs, I knew it because she would attack me. But as I realized, as I looked up, I'm like, that's an amazing angle to capture her dive bombing me, to sort of fill out the story of the Cooper hawk attacking starlings. So we were able to sort of sneak our camera into spots just through understanding the routines of nature.
Mark, in your case, there aren't humans in your story. You're really just telling a story out of these animals.
We are, but we do end up naming them, and that wasn't the intention going in. And our films in the past have been a lot more. We wouldn't dream of naming an animal, and we wouldn't dream of going anywhere close to what used to be called anthropomorphism. I guess still is, but. Working with elephants, what we quickly found was that all the researchers who work with them, they don't call them like DA5. They call them by name. They all have names, and they have family groups, and they all sort of share a common letter. And in fact, Athena, our star, she was named by a scientist there. And so, when we were discussing elephants, we would automatically assign them names, and. The last thing we expected to happen was for that also to apply to a goose, to a gosling. But that was, our field assistant who started calling this gosling that name, and it just stuck. And then, we thought, well, we've got to be really careful here. On one hand, we want to make a film that is popular, speaks to a very broad audience, perhaps not your normal wildlife viewing audience. And because we'd been so cautious about anthropomorphism in the past, it really wasn't until probably into the second or third year that we thought, well, actually, this is, and we discussed it a lot because we're a small team. We discussed it around the table. We all lived together. And we lived together for 4 years, and we came. It was so evident in the end that elephants share very similar emotions to us, and it's like if you keep a dog or perhaps a pig even or a parrot, you certainly know what those animals are feeling. You know when they're happy, you know when they're sad, and it just seemed almost arrogant from a human point of view, and so anthropocentric that we were denying animals those feelings and emotions. And so in the end we thought, well, actually we have to embrace it, because it's so obvious to us, having spent so long around these elephants, that they feel very, very similar emotions to us, and in fact they are just like us. And so in the end we thought we'll embrace it, because elephants are so like us.
Do you have something to add, John?
I was just going to say, and then the thing that we find, I'm sure you all experience this too, is that we have the way of looking at our relationship to the world as a right and wrong type thing, and what you learn within the animal world is that it's all based on consequences for them. And I think it's right. They have these, you can very easily assign these sort of human characteristics but the way they see the world is so enlightening. And I think preserving that at the same time that you kind of loosely anthropomorphize, I don't feel is a mischaracterization of what's really happening in their world. They just see the world, like I say, through consequences only.
There are so many images in all three of your films that just leave me in awe, and I can't even begin to understand how those images were created. Either being very close to an animal, or just capturing something that feels so spontaneous or beautiful. And I wanted to ask each of you about an image that you captured that impressed yourself, and the the techniques that you developed to get that image. Tamara, maybe it's with capturing the bees and getting something that you thought might be there, but you finally capturing it on camera.
Some specific.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a specific scene that when you watch it still today, you think, yeah, we really got that.
I would say it's the opening scene when she's walking on the cliff. That was a challenge to do for sure. We even have a photo of the four of us, how we are exploring different angles, because it's such a very narrow edge.
It seems like for the camera person, you would not want to be looking through the lens. You'd want to be looking at your feet if you're walking along a 2-foot ledge.
So eventually how we did it was one of the cinematographers was first and the others were just holding one to another. He was the other cinematographer was holding the first one and we were holding him. So eventually we made this, but this was probably one of the most difficult shots, I would say. I don't know. Maybe. Also, I would say with the family, most of the things with them, especially
It was harder to shoot humans than to shoot other creatures.
Yes, for sure. Definitely. The coming and the leaving of the family was also very difficult because it's a massive scene. Many things are happening, and because this was in a period of 3 years, we made it 2 times actually. They're coming and going, so we can put it all together.
John, any scenes in The Biggest Little Farm that you're especially proud of?
It's the one that it's a 2-second shot, and there's this relationship between a ladybug, an ant, and an aphid that exists. So an aphid essentially attaches to a plant and sucks the nectar out of the plant. And I'm in New York. We can talk about the mob. It's safe, right? So the aphid has a protector, the ant, and the payment is in exchange that the aphid sort of excretes this honeydew out the backside of it to feed the ant the sweet nectar in exchange for the protection from the ladybug attacking the aphid. And I've never been able, it took us about 3 or 4 years to really capture this 1-2-second shot where the ant walks back behind the aphid, taps it on the back, and the honeydew comes out, and he collects the little bag of money, which is the honeydew, and walks out. And it's so underappreciated, but when I learned that about that relationship, a farmer explained this to me 8 years ago, suddenly I was able to apply that as a filter in understanding how nature works. That there are these mutualistic relationships of protection, and when you can find those things, you can kind of hack into it as a farmer and use it in a way. So we knew that we had to get the ladybug population up to such a degree that it could overpower the mafia, the ants. And around year 5, that's actually what happened. The ladybug population decimated the aphid population on our farm. And that was the moment that I realized that this is the film. Continuing to capture these types of stories. And the more I looked back on the footage that we had shot, and the more we sort of shot through the next 3 years, I realized we were seeing these patterns of balance in every element of the farm.
Mark, in The Elephant Queen, you have grand imagery of elephants, and then you have low to the ground imagery of dung beetles and creatures that burrow underneath the earth. Can you pick from among the images of one that you feel especially proud of?
I mean, I think the one that was hardest to get. Again, it passed in a couple of seconds, and probably anybody who sees the film won't even remember it. But that was to get one of the tiny killifish eggs hatching. And these things are tiny. They're about 0.5 millimeter across. And we knew that the killifish have this lovely system where because they live in seasonal water holes, they dry up during the dry season, but yet the eggs survive in the mud, and the elephants transport the eggs from one water hole to another. And the question is, how do you get one of these eggs to hatch? And not only it's about filming it, so we had to make our own macro bench, and I would scour the internet for these tiny little lenses, and then we made proportional lifters and rotational devices. So we had a system which we knew would work. But what we didn't know was how to get these eggs to hatch, because when I thought about it, it's like, well, if you guys just get a quick rain shower, then the worst thing can happen is for all these eggs to hatch, because it will dry up immediately, and the fish won't live to maturity to be able to breed and spawn. And so it became a bit of a sort of detective exercise in the end, because we would have these little eggs, we would wet them and nothing would happen. We'd dry them out again, we'd wet them, nothing happened. And then we thought, well, what about, maybe it's a pressure difference, because maybe it requires the pool to be deep enough to increase the pressure, so the eggs somehow sense that they've got enough water to go through this whole life cycle. And so we increased the pressure, we put them under deep water, brought them up, nothing happened. And then we thought, well, what about, maybe we don't have, maybe the water's wrong, maybe we've got distilled water or something, maybe we should have water with a lot more sort of humus and humic acid in it, so we would get peat, and we'd soak peat in the water, and then we'd try it again, and nothing happened. And in the end, we thought, well, what about, is there a temperature difference? Is there a shock that happens? Maybe the rain that fills the thing maybe there's a cold shock that creates this. And I'm still not quite sure what it is. But in the end, we tried everything. We increased the pressure. We shocked them. With the temperature change, we added a little bit of carbon dioxide, and we added peat, and in the end we got a couple of those eggs to hatch. And this is something that happens
for a few second shot.
Exactly. This happens all by itself, every year, and it was just so hard to recreate for the camera. And it happened, and it goes past, and nobody ever notices it.
I remember that shot. In a few minutes, I'm going to go to the audience for questions, so get yours ready. I want to ask each of you about the experience you've had with audiences experiencing your film, and what you've seen audiences take away from your film. Tamara, in the case of your film, it came into the Sundance Film Festival last year as a very small film. No one had any expectations for it. And films from Macedonia aren't known to be the ones to blow up and get big distribution deals at the Sundance Film Festival. And so can you talk about what you've experienced with having audiences see this film?
Yes, Sundance was, for all of us, was a great shock. No one expected 3 awards there. No one expected what followed. From that moment, we started a world tour that is not stopped until this day. And it was shown in all over the world, more than 20 awards everywhere. And what we experienced being there and seeing how the audience reacts is that the film affects the audience like a mirror. Like every culture attaches to the problem they have the most and notice this like the main thing, the main layer in the film. For example, when we were in Hong Kong, that was right after Sundance, it was so obvious how people were reacting on the relationship with Hatice and her mother and their solitude. And they were mostly interested in this. And one of the most beautiful lines I will remember from one person from the audience was, he came on the film twice in Hong Kong, the 2 shows, and he was crying the 2 times. He was an older gentleman. And he said, don't let these big crowds fool you. Human solitude is everywhere the same. So this is something that you could see how they are connected with this layer in particular. And for example, every time we show the film in Western society, is it like West Europe or coming here, people are very interested in the consumeristic aspect of the Hussein's family. And one of the audience, I remember, he said, yes, we're just like that, concerning all of us. Because this is something that we must, I mean, also I consider that Macedonia is more and more leaning towards the Western way of life. So in a way, I'm really happy to see that the film is touching everyone, everywhere, on this human way, even if it's a tribe in New Caledonia or if it's shown here. So this makes me really happy, and seeing that the film is affecting as a mirror, trying to raise awareness in all of us what exactly we are doing, because we are Hussein and his family, all of us. And
John, your film started last fall. I showed it at the Toronto International Film Festival. It was our opening night here at Doc NYC last year, and it came into theatrical distribution this year. What's it been like for you to see audiences experience The Biggest Little Farm?
It's been incredible. First of all, I was hopeful it would get maybe a small theatrical release, but it ended up getting one here with Neon in the North America, and then in 20 countries theatrically. So all of that has been really overwhelming, and I think what's really cool about it is that we set out in the very beginning not to make a polarizing film about climate, because I think we've arrived at this point in time where the polarization has reduced us down to just confrontation, and we are abandoning innovation, which is ultimately how we're going to get around this. And I watch people who have, either believe in climate change or don't believe in climate change, but I watch them come out of the screenings and feel just this deep connection and love for what an ecosystem is. And once we convert people to falling in love with it, I feel the opportunity for a bipartisan way to sort of buy into the solutions that exist within an infinitely complex system of agriculture. And I think that has been accomplished, as from what I can tell, as audiences come out and the conversations are very different. And I think, for us, that was the goal from the very beginning.
Mark, in the case of The Elephant Queen, I also showed it last year at the Toronto Film Festival. Then it's played many film festivals, and you've had to wait until now, finally, for it to come out and for the world to experience it on Apple Plus. But the experiences that you've had showing it to audiences, and now that it's reaching much wider audiences, what has that meant for you?
I think when we started this film, we had really 2 aims, and one was to reach the widest possible audience, and the other was to make a difference on the ground for elephants. And the fact that Apple have come in on it is fantastic, because it means that when we set out to make people fall in love with elephants, we've now got the potential of it reaching 1.5 billion screens and really getting the message out to a number of people, a huge number of people, and trying also then to direct their concern into where they might help elephants on the ground. But I think one of the most extraordinary screenings we had was when we had the premiere in New York, and we'd invited some of the Kenyan delegation who came to the UN climate change to come and see the film. And a Kenyan lady came up afterwards, and she said, this film has completely changed my consciousness about elephants. And this is a woman who lives, she has a farm in the middle of Kenya. She lives alongside elephants. And she said, I just never realized they were so like us. She said, "I've been fearful of elephants. I've wanted, I've seen no reason to have them in our lives. They're animals that attack my crops. I fear them. They're dangerous when the kids go to school." She said, "But from watching the film, she said, I now realise that they're so like us that I'm going to take down the fences in my farm. I realise that I'm on an elephant migration corridor, and I'm going to try and learn to live alongside them. And I hope that when the film goes back to Kenya, which is what we're working on now with a big outreach and education project, that it will touch people in that same way."
Let me go to the audience for questions. Yeah, right here in the second row.
I'm wondering, we live in a very industrial farming system, and it's almost scripted, quote unquote. And a lot of our films are also scripted. And since you took yourself out of the film realm for many years and started going into this regenerative, ecosystem-based farming practice, did that also change how you approach filmmaking? And then second part, what do you guys hope to do next?
So the question was for John, because he had taken himself out of filmmaking and put himself into regenerative farming for several years before going to filmmaking again. Did your experiences as a farmer change the way you approached filmmaking?
Well, it's crazy. I mean, films and farms don't want to work. That's just like from go, right? And I think, I had to remind myself of that quote that in narrative film, the director is God, but in documentary, God is the director. And I remember when I told my fellow filmmaker friends that I was leaving the industry to become a farmer, there was first a lot of jealousy over the fact that I may not need the thing that they need. And so they were talking me out of it. They're going to be, you're going to be so bored. But what I realized was that my brain, the same way I look at story, was being used every single day to solve problems and to look for these opportunities that, my ego didn't want to see, because it's not what I wanted to have happen with my tomato plants, or not what I wanted to see happen with the sheep today. And it's amazing how that kind of came back into sort of a method of farming and understanding, and kind of taking an advantage of the opportunities and the accidents that we all captured, like the family moving in, right? I don't know how you got that dung beetle shot, by the way. I'm so envious of that. So I think it really did, the filmmaking really informed, at least the documentary side, really informed the way I looked at struggle and things not working on the farm.
The second part of his question was about projects that you're working on now. I know Tamara and Mark and John, you've all been so preoccupied with getting your current films out. Do you have the ability to be thinking about the next one yet? Tomorrow?
Well, it's very good actually, because I'm planning to do my first debut fiction next, so I can spend some valuable time writing. It's not that easy if you do your next documentary. But I think once you're in the documentary world, you eventually always come back to it somehow. It drags you. But for me, the storytelling is documentary should look like fiction, and fiction should look like documentary. So this is the thing I'm following for my next film.
John, in your case, you remain a farmer, and how do you see that balance going forward?
Well, I have 90 terabytes of footage, so I'm feeling like I should do something with that. And so I've been, I feel like with the film, I sort of set up the Serengeti. I set up the players, I set up how it works. And now I can go more deeply into the things that would not be easy for people to sort of accept and take on, just because they didn't have the framing of how the whole system works. And so I'm really interested in this idea of a multi-part series. And so that's what I'm working on.
And Mark, you and Victoria?
Well, normally the films we make take sort of 2 years in the field, and at the end we come out thinking that we've really immersed ourselves in the subject, and hopefully we've done it justice. This film, The Elephant Queen, took 4 years to make in the field, and in that time we've just become more and more enamored with elephants. And it kind of feels that we've really only just scratched the surface, and they are just extraordinary animals. And I wouldn't be surprised if we went back out and, and got involved with elephants again.
Where are you based now?
Well, we tend to move back and forwards. When we're filming, we're based in East Africa and normally in a camp. When we're editing, we want to then, in a way, have a sort of more Western perspective on it. So we tend to edit in the UK, in Cornwall. And that's where we are now, but we're going back at the end of November.
Okay. Take a question if you go. Yeah, Asif Kapadia.
I was just wondering, because you're dealing with like nature, real people and animals, was there a particular moment when at some point you had to put the camera down because something happened? You've been waiting for years for that moment and you didn't get it, and you never did get that shot, that moment, that birth, whatever it was.
So if anyone did, I'll let this question sink in. I'll repeat it if anyone didn't hear it. You know, in trying to capture these incredible nature moments, like Mark, you described one of trying to get that egg to hatch. You know, is there one that you're still trying to capture? Is there one that you missed because, as Asif said, you put the camera down in the wrong moment? It still eludes you.
Yes, I mean, I think the one time I felt utter frustration was when we were at the first site we started filming, and we'd got to know this crocodile in the waterhole that was still there, and it dried up, and this crocodile then decided to walk from one waterhole to a cave, and we knew where he was going, and we were there, and I got out the car. You know, I could get quite close to him because he was single-minded, and I thought, okay, I'm going to do this tracking shot alongside this croc because it's such an unusual scene. It was right out in the almost like the desert. It was dry and dusty, and I went to turn the camera on, and it didn't have a memory card in it, and I think to this day I kick myself. We went straight back to camp, which was a couple of miles away. Came back, no sign of the croc. And I just, that was a desperate day.
I put a tent on a barn roof next to a barn owl box, and they were incredibly wily. They didn't, if we were around, they wouldn't do their thing, and I wanted to capture them bringing gophers back. And the first couple of times I did it, I would make a noise, and that would be it. They would leave, and I would never see them again. So the third time I did it, I was up there for 2 nights, and I thought ahead. And as they were calling to their mom, I recorded their voice. And the next time I made a noise and they all looked over at me, I played their voice back on my iPhone. And they were like, oh, okay, it's probably just an owl. So eventually I got that shot, but it eluded me for a number of years because of how aware they were. I mean, they can see in the dark, right? So how aware they were of us.
Tamara, any shot that you really wanted to get and missed?
Well, you reminded me now with this that we had the biggest problem with the cows dying and giving birth. The first year when we came there was a disease. 100 dead cows were everywhere, and we didn't record this because we didn't think about this at the beginning. We just thought of the bees. And it turned out to be crucial later. This never repeated, luckily, I mean, for the people. But cows were dying constantly, so we managed to catch some of them. And also the baby cows always gave, every time we were waiting for a cow to give birth, it gave birth the day we left. So eventually this happened in one of the last shootings. But now I think that I regret the most not shooting that Atiji on Manhattan and not putting this in the film.
Because your figure, the Macedonian woman who collects honey, Hadija, has been here this week, and you have not been filming her. All right, we have time for one more question. Yeah, right here.
I've heard in a lot of your stories about you kind of came to a point where you realized the movie you thought you were going to make, you're going to have to make a decision and go on, or you realized you had a movie. Can one or all of you just say a little bit about that moment where you really had to go into yourself and decide okay, yeah, I'm going to do this?
If you didn't hear, the question is asking about, the moment in the process of filmmaking where you weren't sure whether you had a movie or not, and had to go inside yourself to push forward and get it done. Tamara, you want?
Well, for me, I already mentioned it. This is the moment when the family arrived. By that point, we were still not sure how this film would look like. Will it have narration, or just Atija would make the narration, or just, we didn't know. But when they appeared, this was a moment of saying, okay, we're going further. And the moment when we knew it's over was the death of Atija's mother, when we finally knew this is the end of this chapter, and now something new starts. So.
I don't know if this answers the question, but an interesting side note: we were editing the film in the barn when the fires broke out. So that was
which, for people who haven't seen The Biggest Little Farm, it sort of frames the film. At the beginning of the film, these fires break out, and it feels like there's a danger that this thing that you've spent 8 years trying to build could be wiped out very quickly.
And it happened to be the Thomas Fire, which at the time was the largest fire in recorded history. It burned 50 miles north of the farm. It passed our farm. We didn't get burned by that fire, but the idea that there was we evacuated with the computer and the drives about 8 times in the period of 6 weeks while that fire was burning and stopping and restarting. So there was a point in time where I thought I might not actually be able to finish the film because all the footage was gone. And then we invested in LTO backups and then had an off-site storage system. But that's the closest. I think it's at year 5 I committed to making the story, and I felt like the only thing that could make it not work would be me being in the way of what needed to be said.
Mark, this is a long journey for you in making the film of the Elephant Queen. How did you and Victoria kind of continue to keep your resolve?
I think that was hard. It was, I think making this film was as hard, and it felt as precarious as making the first film we did, when we had no backing. And for this film, we had a bit of angel investment, but for the 4 years we were in the field, we couldn't pay any of us, any of the crew, and it was really just trying to keep everybody going. But I mean, it helps that Vicky and I are a couple, so that one of us goes up, one of us goes down, the other one tends to help pull them out of it. But I think what was so lovely about it was the fact that because everybody was totally invested emotionally and financially. I mean, nobody knew whether they'd see anything from this, but we basically had to sell. When we came out of the field, we then had to raise money to edit. We then had to raise money for music, and it just these sort of hurdles kept coming up. But we surmounted them. But it was the fact that in the field, because we were also passionate about what we were doing, there was an amazing energy about it, and that really pulled everyone through because. It's difficult. 4 years in the field with a very small group of people, you become quite like a family. And life goes on. There are tragedies. There are happy times, but it was just the fact that everybody was there for Elephants making this film, and that somehow kept us going. And it, for me, it is the best filmmaking experience I've ever had.
We are going to wrap it up there.